Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we have some very important news out of the state of California, where former Vice President Kamala Harris will officially not run for governor of the state in 2026. So as the time recording this news is just broken a few minutes ago. So I'm going to read the political article that describes this and what's going on here. Then I'll give my own thoughts about Harris and what her future moves could potentially be. So the article from Politico by Melanie Mason says that Kamala Harris won't run for governor of California, she said on Wednesday, foregoing a shot at her home state's highest post to keep the possibility of another White House bid in 2028. She said, in recent months, I have given serious thought to asking the people of California for the privilege to serve as their governor. Harris said in a statement, I love this state, its people, and its promise. It is my home, but after deep reflection, I've decided that I will not run for governor in this election. Her decision reopens the possibility of another presidential campaign by one of the Democratic Party's most prominent figures. In her statement, however, she expressed misgivings with what she cast as the limitations of government. She said, I have an extraordinary admiration and respect for those who dedicate their lives to public service to their communities and to our nation. At the same time, we must recognize that our politics, our government, and our institutions have too often failed the American people, culminating in this moment of crisis. As we look ahead, we must be willing to pursue change through new methods and fresh thinking, committed to our same values and principles, but not bound by the same playbook. Harris continued, saying, for now, my leadership and public service will not be in elected office. I look forward to getting back out and listening to the American people, helping elect Democrats across the nation who will fight fearlessly and sharing more details in the months ahead about my own plans. Now, this particular paragraph by Harris I think is very important and a very interesting one to note. Her saying she's going to go across the country and try and help get Democrats elected, that's something that a presidential candidate would often do. For instance, I remember back in 2014, you would see Republicans like Chris Christie or Mitt Romney or Jeb Bush, who were all considering running for president in 2016 at the time, going to important states like Iowa, like New Hampshire, like South Carolina, like Nevada, and trying to get the Republican candidates in those respected races elected, also is trying to lay the groundwork for a future presidential bid. You also saw this with Hillary Clinton as well in 2016, where she was going around the country in 2014 trying to get Democrats elected. So this is a very popular, common move that you do see of presidential candidates. Doesn't mean for sure Harris is going to run, but at very least, that would be something a presidential candidate would be doing. Now, Harris's announcement upends the contest to succeed Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom, which has been largely static as the field braced for a possible Harris candidacy. I'll be getting more into the polls and such in just one moment. With near universal name identification, strong approval ratings among Democrats, and national fundraising network, Harris would have begun the race as the imposing frontrunner. But there were actually some warning signs for Harris, though formidable, would face some challenges in the quest for the governor's mansion. Party activists and some donors were lukewarm to her potential bid, still nursing a hangover from the 2024 election and reluctant to be reminded of her losing the presidential campaign. And pressure was mounting for Harris to articulate a vision for governing a massive state and a complicated state where she has not lived full-time in nearly a decade. So this is very interesting. On the Kamala Harris side of things, this really does open the door for her to run again in 2028. Now, obviously, we're in July, almost August of 2025. So talking about 2028 now, we're still a long ways away. But in recent polling, Kamala Harris had a large lead right after the 2024 presidential election, and I noted multiple times in past videos that historically when an election happens, the candidate that loses starts out as their political party's frontrunner for the next election. Unless they were absolutely embarrassed and kind of essentially shunned from the party, they usually start out as the person most likely to be the nominee again, because these early primary polls are essentially a popularity contest of who Democrats or Republicans have heard from. And Kamala Harris, being the Democratic nominee in every single state in the United States just back in November, she is the person that most Democrats in the country that could be a candidate in 2028 have heard of. But her lead has already started to dwindle. Now in the race to White House average, she's only down to a 3.7% lead, as we've seen Pete Buttigieg rise up to second place at 17.4%, and her fellow Californian Gavin Newsom also rising to 12.7%. Also worth noting, New York Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who herself is going around the country giving a lot of speeches, getting a lot of Democrats excited for a potential 2028 bid as well. She is polling right now in fourth place at 11.9%. So with Harris included, there's already 4 Democratic candidates breaking 10% of the vote in the early race to the White House average. Now, what's true is without Harris in this race, it is still a very close race that could go many ways. Buttigieg and Newsom start out as the first 2 candidates, first place, with AOC then in third. But with Kamala Harris not running for governor of California now, the odds of Harris making another presidential bid in 2028 have gone up a lot. It's possible Harris, what she said in her statement, is truthful, and she decides that she just doesn't want to run for president again in 2028, and she decides not to run. But at very least, the possibility of her running in 2028 now is greater. Her going around the country, introducing herself to local Democrats and trying to get Democrats elected could essentially be seen as well as laying the groundwork for a potential run in 2028. And again, it shouldn't need to be worth noting, Kamala Harris only had about 100 days to campaign for president, where typically presidential campaigns last at least 2 years. So she could potentially be laying the groundwork now to have a longer campaign and try to do that for 2028, where this time around she'll have the mantle of being the former vice president to run on. However, it's not always going to work out 100%. It's very rare that we've seen former vice presidents or presidents who have lost the general election come back and win. Off the top of my head, you could say Donald Trump obviously just did it, but Donald Trump was very much the exception to the rule. That had not happened where a president lost, came back, and then won 4 years later. That had not happened for a very long time. Now, Kamala Harris was the vice president. She did lose the 2024 election, and she will, if she runs in 2028, it would be a different election where it would be after 4 years of a Republican president than 4 years of a Democratic president. So depending on how the Trump administration is doing, that does open the possibility for Kamala Harris having a better chance of winning if she does decide to run. However, the first hurdle that she would have to clear is getting through the Democratic primary, where after the 2024 campaign, there seems to be a lot of appetite for Democrats for change, for someone different, for someone new. Right now, Pete Buttigieg is leading in the most recent Atlas Intel poll in first place in that. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is in second place, Gavin Newsom's in third, Kamala Harris is actually in fourth. So Pete Buttigieg and AOC especially are 2 younger, fresh faces in the Democratic Party seeking to potentially change things for 2028. Where Harris and Newsom have been around a little bit in the last few years, getting their names out there in the media, they are also looking at potentially running. So what the Democrats decide to do for 2028 is very interesting. But this news, at very least, leaves open the possibility of Harris running again. Now for California, things are going to get really interesting here because there are several Democrats in this race. Several of them said they would drop out of the race if Kamala Harris decided to run. Now that she is not going to run, this race is really wide open. The way California does it is the top 2 vote getters in the jungle primary advance to the general election. So it's possible that you could have 2 Democrats facing off in the general election for governor of California. The way it's gone in the past, in the last few cycles, were 1 Democrat, 1 Republican. But there are a lot of candidates running on both the Democratic and Republican sides. So unless any of them break out, we're really not going to know how this is going to work out until now. Most of the polls that had Kamala Harris in them showed Harris starting out with an early lead. When Harris was not in the race, Katie Porter, the Democrat, had 12%, and then other Democrats had 5 and 3, and other Republicans had 4 and 3. Polls that included John Cox, who was one time the Republican nominee for governor back, I believe, was that 2018. He had 21%, Harris had 23%, Katie Porter had 16%. So you could argue of all the Democrats in this race, the one that seeks most to benefit from Kamala Harris not running would probably be Katie Porter. Another key thing to watch for is Republican Steve Garvey, who is a very close ally of President Trump. He specifically said if Kamala Harris decided to run for this race, that he would be interested in running in this race against Kamala Harris. With Kamala Harris now not running, it'll be interesting to watch if he decides to make a run or not. Probably, if based on his own words, probably won't, but that could be something very interesting to watch for as well. There are a lot of Republicans running, there are a lot of Democrats running, and who becomes the Democratic nominee, and maybe the Republican nominee, maybe another Democrat wins, it all remains to be seen. But it's going to be wide open for now, and we're going to have to wait and see how that all goes. The last poll was back in April. Now that Harris is not running, I would expect we see a governor poll out of California in the next month or so as we get kind of an update on how the race is looking without Harris's name thrown in the mix. From the general election, though, this is going to be a pretty reliable Democratic win. Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, Tablet Crystal Ball all have it listed as safe for the Democrats. California, the presidential race in 2024, Kamala Harris won the state versus Donald Trump by 20 points. Back in 2020, Joe Biden won it by 29 points. 2016, Hillary Clinton won it by 30 points. So California's actually moved about 10 points to the right from 2020 to 2024. But again, it's probably going to be a safe Democratic state, even with that. Back in 2022, Gavin Newsom won re-election by 18.4%. I think we probably see the Democrats win here by at least 18 points in 2026. So starting out, I do have California as a safe Democratic win, and I'm going to keep it in that category regardless of who the Democrats end up nominating now that Harris is not running. But I do expect California will be a safe Democratic win. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found this news interesting. If you did, make sure to leave a comment below. Tell me your thoughts on all this. Do you think Harris is going to run for president in 2028 now that she's not running for governor in 2026? Leave all your thoughts down below. Also, if you really enjoyed this video, make sure to hit like and subscribe so you get notified when I post more videos like this one. I post 3 videos every single day that you're not going to want to miss. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. Today we have a very interesting video talking about specifically the 2026 Senate race in the state of Michigan. In an article by CNN, it goes over some recent news about Democrats trying to recruit candidates for respective Senate races, including Georgia, and also talk about Maine and New Hampshire and Texas. But particularly this part of the article about Michigan really caught my eye, and I think it's something that's very interesting. The article on CNN talks about how the Republicans are now uniting behind former Republican Representative Mike Rogers to be the party's nominee after losing a very close Senate race in 2024. Rogers got a boost when Representative Bill Huizenga passed on a Senate run a few days and weeks ago now after a push from President Trump to defend his potentially competitive House seat in Western Michigan. But on the Democratic side, things are going to be very interesting because the Democrats, however, have a competitive primary underway that includes 3 well-known Democratic contenders, Representative Haley Stevens, State Senator Mallory McMorrow, and progressive former gubernatorial candidate Abdul El-Sayed. Now, this is the part that has been new news here. Several Democratic sources of CNN spoke with Chuck Schumer, the Senator of New York, the Senate Minority Leader, and his team have privately signaled they believe that Haley Stevens is the strongest general election candidate. In another nod to Stevens' Democratic establishment support, she earned the endorsement from former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi earlier this summer, and 2 people involved in Michigan politics said Gillibrand has privately, Democratic Senator from New York as well, has privately encouraged donors to support Haley Stevens. So this is very interesting here because the Democrats nationally made comments, of course, about saying the Republicans are going to lose and Democrats are going to win, as they normally would. But there's also some interesting quotes here from Democrats in Michigan. Democrats thus far have been surprised by the strong fundraising power of Abdul El-Sayed, backed by independent Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who has been urging his party to take a more aggressive stance on President Trump. Democrats in the state of Michigan are hoping they can unite behind a candidate before next August's primary because there have been some hurdles, including interpersonal disputes between Slotkin and other major players in the state, including Governor Gretchen Whitmer. They also fear that the state's race for governor won't help either, as Mike Duggan, the popular Detroit mayor, has decided to run as an independent, potentially splintering the Democratic base and raising questions about what that could mean for the Michigan Senate and House races as well. A Democrat saying, "I don't think people understand how dysfunctional the Senate race is." One Michigan Democrat told CNN about the 3-way primary. "If we don't pull people together, we are screwed." So this is one where, despite Michigan's Democratic primary being very competitive, I actually think it's going a little bit under the radar in terms of the overall 2026 discussion. Because Michigan right now is one of 3 seats I currently have in the toss-up rating. Now, obviously this week, just for clarity, I'm recording this on Wednesday. So North Carolina, we just got the news that Roy Cooper has entered the race as the Democratic candidate. RNC Chair Michael Whatley is expected to enter the race as the Republican candidate any day now. So North Carolina has been getting a lot of the attention recently. Georgia, with Democrat John Ossoff, also getting some attention, as Republican Mike Collins and Republican Doug Dooley have either entered the race or are just about to enter. Michigan's candidates are all now already in their respective race and have been running for a few weeks now, or even a few months now. But the Democratic primary underway in Michigan is really, really fascinating, because we're kind of seeing some echoes here, perhaps, of the New York City mayoral election where Zohran Mamdani upset Andrew Cuomo and won as a far more to the left Democrat compared to the more establishment pick of Andrew Cuomo. And we could be seeing something going under the way here in Michigan. Just to give you an idea, Haley Stevens, as the article suggested, seems to be more of the establishment-backed Democratic candidate. Not exactly like Elisa Slotkin from 2 years ago in 2024 in that election, but it could be something more similar to that regard. Whereas Abdul El-Sayed and Mallory McMorrow are both trying to run more on the anti-Trump farther left part of the Democratic Party. Abdul El-Sayed thus far seems to be leading in that regard on the farther left Bernie Sanders, Zohran Mamdani, AOC part of the Democratic Party. Now, Mallory McMorrow's role in this is going to be very interesting, as she's running as a state senator, and she's actually getting a pretty considerable amount of support so far. Joe Tate, a state representative right now, is also running in this race. He doesn't poll as high as the others, but him and McMorrow are trying to fight it out for third place right now, even though McMorrow is currently holding that lead right now. Another interesting situation here is Dana Nessel, the Michigan Attorney General, has expressed interest in running for this race and potentially running for governor as well. She has not made an official decision. If she were to enter this race, that could potentially change things as well. But at least at its simplest form right now, we have Haley Stevens representing the more establishment part of the Democratic Party, Abdul El-Sayed capturing the farther left Bernie Sanders wing of the party, and Mallory McMorrow sort of in between the two, trying to find her lane in this primary as well. And the early polling thus far has really shown how tight of a race this is. The first poll from the the most recent poll from the National Republican Senatorial Committee, so it is the National Republican, so take this with a grain of salt. Haley Stevens leads at 24%, Abdul El-Sayed's in second place at 22%, Mallory McMorrow's in third with 11%, Joe Tate's in fourth with 1%, still 42% of the vote undecided according to that poll. Now, the Global Strategy Group, a Democratic-aligned pollster, which is sponsored by Mallory McMorrow's campaign, shows a tighter race for her, with Haley Stevens still in the lead at 24%, McMorrow at 20%, Abdul El-Sayed at 15%, and Joe Tate at 4%. But in this one, there's 37% of the vote that is undecided. And then you have the Glenn Garriff Group poll, a poll that was sponsored by the Detroit Regional Chamber. This is technically an unaffiliated poll. In this one, Haley Stevens has a larger lead, 34% for her, Abdul El-Sayed 22%, Mallory McMorrow 14%, with 30% undecided. So thus far, it's been pretty consistent that Haley Stevens has held a lead in this race. The question is, by how much? The most recent Republican poll, she's up by 2 points, which does fall within the margin of error. In the 3.5% poll, she has a 4-point lead, so it's just about outside the margin of error lead for Stevens there. In the Glenn Garriff Group poll, Stevens leads by about 12 points, which is outside the margin of error by a pretty considerable amount. But the key caveat here is there's still a lot of undecided vote left here, with roughly 30 to 40%, depending on the poll, still undecided in this race, as these candidates are trying to introduce themselves to Michigan Democrats. So this could get very interesting now. Now, the fundraising, as is mentioned, Haley Stevens, which has the backing, it seems, of a lot of national establishment Democrats, has already raised roughly $2.8 million and has a little bit under $2 million cash on hand to spend. But Abdul El-Sayed, who has the backing of more the far left wing of the party, has raised about $1.8 million, currently has $1.1 million cash to spend. Mallory McMorrow's also raised about $2.1 million and has about $826,000 cash in hand to spend. So all these candidates have a pretty considerable amount of spending and cash on hand to go after Michigan Democrats and try and get their names out there as much as possible. So from that standpoint, things are very, very fascinating. Now, in the endorsements, Stevens does have the endorsement of the former governor of Michigan, James Blanchard, and 4 U.S. representatives, most notably being Nancy Pelosi and Representative Hillary Scholten of Michigan's 3rd District. Whereas McMorrow has the endorsement of a lot of state representatives and state senators, doesn't hold the same national weight as some of the endorsements from Stevens and Abdul El-Sayed, but she has many of those as well. Abdul El-Sayed has the endorsement of Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna, a U.S. representative from California, as well as Mayor of Dearborn, Michigan, Abdullah Hamid. So this is going to be really interesting because this Democratic primary could get very nasty and be very, very tight all the way to the election day for the Democratic primary. So this is certainly very interesting to watch. And we know that they're going to face off against Republican Mike Rogers, who is now the only notable Republican candidate in this race after other Republicans have passed on a run. Mike Rogers now has officially the endorsement of President Donald Trump and Senators Tim Scott, John Thune, and John Barrasso. Both Thune and Scott are in charge of trying to get Republicans elected to the U.S. Senate in 2026, and they were giving him his support even before the other Republican, Bill Huizenga, ruled out a run. Now, for the general election, this is where things get very interesting. Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, and Sabra Crystal Ball all have the race listed as a toss-up, and the early polling so far certainly seems to suggest that. However, in the three polls, one of them was conducted by a Democratic pollster, the other two were non-Democratic pollsters. They showed Haley Stevens leading over Mike Rogers in two of the three polls. Stevens having about a 2-point lead over Stevens in the Democratic poll, Glenn Garrett Group showing Stevens leading over Rogers in the first part by about 1 point, and then Rogers leading over Stevens by about 6 points from the Target Insight poll, though that one has a lot of undecided vote. For Abdul Al-Sayed versus Mike Rogers, only the Glenn Garrett Group poll, which showed Stevens leading by 1. Here, Rogers actually leads on the first part of the poll by about 6 points, so 12% undecided. And then for McMorrow versus Rogers, Rogers leads over McMorrow by 4 points, and in the second Glenn Garrett Group poll by about 4. So what's interesting is Rogers seems to do the best against Abdul Al-Sayed and Mallory McMorrow, but does the worst against Haley Stevens. So that could be very interesting. If Haley Stevens becomes a Democratic nominee, it seems to give the Democrats the strongest chance, at least at the strongest floor, in the general election for this race. Whereas if Abdul Al-Sayed wins, it seems that gives Mike Rogers the best chance at winning the general election in Michigan. Mallory McMorrow, Rogers starts out with a lead, but it doesn't seem to be as large of a lead as the Abdul Al-Sayed race would be, but Rogers does start with a lead in that one as well. So this is interesting. Not only does the Democratic primary could it determine who the Democrats end up nominating, but it may potentially decide if they accidentally hand the Republicans a Republican senator if these trends do continue further down the line in 2026. Now, as I mentioned, the Senate map right now, I have 3 Senate seats, Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia, listed as toss-ups right now. New Hampshire and Maine I currently have listed as a lean for the Democrats and Republicans, respectively. The Republicans are in for a tough race in North Carolina with now Roy Cooper looking like it's going to be versus Michael Whatley. It certainly could go 50-50 right now, but what if the Democrats are able to win this seat? Well, that would be a Democratic flip. The Democrats would then be up 1 Senate seat. Let's say John Ossoff holds on and wins re-election in Georgia. Well, then the Republicans would still be down 1 Senate seat. What if Mike Rogers faces off against Abdul Al-Sayed and is able to narrowly win the state of Michigan in the Senate race here? This would get the Republicans back up to 53 Senate seats. Democrats and Republicans both won 1 seat of the opposite party, so the Senate composition by the numbers don't change. It's just Michigan and North Carolina flip these seats. What if, in this scenario, Michael Whatley is able to narrowly eke out a victory versus Roy Cooper, and then we see Republicans actually gaining a Senate seat by winning the state of Michigan? So this Michigan Senate race is very interesting, and which Democrat wins the primary could make the difference between whether the Republicans end up losing 1 or maybe 2 Senate seats in 2026, or maybe the Republicans actually gaining a Senate seat in 2026. So this whole situation is very interesting, and one that I certainly want to keep an eye on going forward now for the next few weeks and few months as this Michigan Democratic primary gets underway. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did. Leave a comment below. Tell me all your thoughts, and I hope to see you in a future video. Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we have a very interesting news and poll out of the state of New York and out of New York City, where Democrat Zohran Mamdani beats all of the New York City mayoral candidates combined in a new poll. So the 33-year-old self-described Democratic Socialist leads a 5-candidate New York City mayoral race by double digits and amasses more than 50% of the vote, regardless of his opponent. So, just to give you an idea of what this is, a new poll of 1,453 New York City residents, which was conducted by Zenith Research, and Public Progress Solutions from July 16th to July 24th found that Mamdani with a commanding lead in the current field of 5, attaining 50% of the vote, while the combined level of support for all of the other 4 candidates and undecided likely voters totaled 49%. Cuomo placed in second, receiving 22% of the vote, while Curtis Sliwa finished in third with 13%, Eric Adams in fourth with 7%, and Jim Waldron finished in fifth with 1%. Others, I don't know, totaled about 6% of the vote. In a 4-way race, without Cuomo, Mamdani's support increased to 55%. In a 4-way race without Adams, Mamdani's backing rose to 51%. Now, Mamdani's level of support never dips below 50% in the poll and increases with a thinner field in head-to-head contest. A one-on-one matchup between Zohran Mamdani and Andrew Cuomo results in a win for the Assemblyman of 52% to 40% per the poll, with 8% of respondents saying they are undecided. Mamdani's advantage grows if facing off against Adams, increasing to 59% compared to 32% for the sitting mayor. With the current 5 candidates in this race, Zohran Mamdani holds a commanding 28-point lead over Cuomo, who splits the opposition with Sliwa, and Adams, said Adam Carlson, the founding partner of Zenith Research, who sent a statement provided to Newsweek. With the majority of voters saying they wouldn't even consider voting for Cuomo, Adams' net favorability rating being lower than President Trump's, and Curtis Sliwa mired in the low teens, it's hard to see how anyone could put a serious scare into Mamdani in a split field. Mamdani is also the only candidate the majority of respondents would consider 58% voting for in this fall's election. In comparison, 37% said they would consider voting for Cuomo, 27% would consider voting for Adams, 26% for Sliwa, and 10% for Waldron. When asked who voters would not consider voting for, only 32% of respondents said they would not consider voting for Mamdani, whereas Andrew Cuomo, Adams, Sliwa, and Waldron were 60%, 68%, 59%, and 40% respectively. Half of respondents said they don't know enough about Jim Waldron to properly answer, the highest percentage by far. 35% don't know or want to know more about Sliwa. 40% want to know more about Mamdani. Now, Amit Singh Baga, the founder and principal of Public Progress Solutions, sent a statement shared with Newsweek that the independent poll, the first in the cycle to be offered in 4 languages and capture national origin and religious denomination, said, quote, makes one thing clear. Black union households, young Jews, South Asians, East Asians, Latinos, and New Yorkers in every income bracket are all on the same Zohran Mamdani bus. And it's headed in the direction of the Democratic Party's future, Baga said. Forget the DNC's postmortem. These results are the blueprint for the evolution to stave off extinction. The question is, are we listening? So this is very interesting out of New York City and with this poll. Thus far, in the early polling we've seen for the general election, it's looked like in a lot of close polls that Zohran Mamdani has certainly been leading, but there could be a potential for one candidate running opposed to him to potentially reach over 50% and defeat Mamdani. But in this poll, it actually shows that's not the case, and Mamdani breaks 50% here. It does confirm a few things we have seen in prior polls, though. For one, it seems that in a head-to-head matchup, Andrew Cuomo is the strongest candidate to go up against Mamdani, and even still, he loses by about 12% in this poll. But Eric Adams is even more unpopular in the city of New York than Andrew Cuomo is. In the head-to-head between Mamdani and Adams, Mamdani would lead Eric Adams by an even larger margin than Mamdani leads against Cuomo. It's also worth noting that Sliwa, Adams, and Waldron and Cuomo are all splitting the anti-Mamdani vote, and if they all remain in the race, there's no way one candidate is going to be able to catch Mamdani. Now, this poll suggests that even if all but one candidate drops out, they still not be able to defeat Zohran Mamdani, but still, it gives them a better chance at doing so. But it would not be possible with all of them in this race. Now, there isn't the only poll that's done this talk, and it showed in a WIC poll from back in around the same time in July that in the first head-to-head matchups, Mamdani starts out with 39%, Cuomo 21%, 18% for Curtis Sliwa, 9% for Eric Adams. In that head-to-head matchup, Cuomo leads 42 to 41 versus Mamdani with 17% saying they are undecided. But in that same poll, Mamdani got 47%, Adams only had 37%. And for Sliwa versus Mamdani, Mamdani is 53, 35% for Sliwa. that poll also confirms one thing's for sure: Curtis Lewa has zero chance of becoming the next mayor of New York City. All he's doing is stopping Cuomo and maybe Eric Adams from defeating Zohran Mamdani, but Curtis Lewa has zero chance at being the next mayor of New York City. Now, in this one, Andrew Cuomo at 42% is significant, but it's not really much higher than the Zenith research poll, which showed Cuomo at 40%. So his numbers are not much higher here in this poll than in the last poll that just came out as well. The only difference is Mamdani's 41% is much lower than the 52% they have him getting in this poll. But it's still worth noting that 17% of voters are undecided, which could mean that the first poll may actually be correct, and even still in this race, enough of that 17% may go for Mamdani as opposed to Cuomo, and that may end up being the situation here. Right now, it seems like there are a lot of Democrats and independents in New York City that don't want Zohran Mamdani to be mayor and are concerned with the prospect of him being mayor would be. But it seems that in the early polling thus far, the prospect of Mamdani becoming the mayor seems to be less scary than the prospect of voting for Andrew Cuomo, who is still significantly more disliked among Democratic voters and independent voters than Zohran Mamdani is. And even though a lot of independents and some Democrats and a lot of Republicans are trying to go after Mamdani as this like evil, unstoppable force that needs to be defeated, even still, a lot of voters in New York City show that they would rather vote for Mamdani than they would for Andrew Cuomo or Eric Adams. And that's the reality of the race right now. Mamdani has a pretty strong footing in these early races, and as long as this race becomes a 4 or 5 person race, Mamdani's going to become the next mayor of New York City without really too much of a problem. Now, if all the candidates except for one were to drop out of the race and it became a head-to-head matchup, say for Mamdani versus Andrew Cuomo, this race could get potentially competitive. But even still, I do think that Zohran Mamdani, until I see otherwise, would start out as the favorite in that race. And this poll shows a large reason why, which is Andrew Cuomo is still very unpopular from his days being the governor of New York, and just a few weeks ago, from his rejection in the Democratic primary, a lot of voters in New York City do not like Andrew Cuomo and do not want to see him return to public office, and they would much rather vote for Zohran Mamdani in that scenario than vote for Cuomo. Now, in a Harris X poll from back towards the beginning part of July, we do see kind of a similar situation in this race until the head-to-head matchup, where in the 4-person race, Mamdani leads at 26, Sliwa 22, Adams 13, and Cuomo 23. Now, in the head-to-head matchup on this one, Cuomo gets up to 50%, Mamdani only has 35, with 15% undecided. But in that one, Mamdani has 43, 36% for Eric Adams in that head-to-head matchup. So the last few polls have been kind of all over the place. The wild card here is trying to determine what Zohran Mamdani's percentage ends up being, because it looks like Eric Adams and Curtis Lewa do not have a chance at getting elected mayor or re-elected mayor in this election. The only chance in stopping Zohran Mamdani would be Mamdani versus Cuomo. But Cuomo's level of support in these polls and Mamdani's level of support in these polls seem to be very volatile. And as more New Yorkers learn about Zohran Mamdani, it's really interesting to see that his numbers based on the last month or so in July, based on these polls, his numbers have actually gone up. Mamdani in that head-to-head versus Cuomo was 50 to 35. In the WIC matchup, it was 41 to 42. Now, in this most recent poll here, the head-to-head matchup of Cuomo versus Mamdani was 52 to 40. So it seems at very least, and in this first part of the poll as well, if you want to go off this part, the different terminology in this one was Mamdani at 46, Cuomo at 43. So regardless, it seems Zohran Mamdani's floor of support in the last month or so has actually gone up since the Democratic primary against Andrew Cuomo. What was once a 15% lead for Cuomo then became a 1-point lead for Cuomo in the WIC poll, and now is about a 3-point lead at worst for Zohran Mamdani in this poll. So it's very interesting to watch how this race develops. Zohran Mamdani right now, in my own personal predictions and feelings for this race, is I do think Mamdani starts out as the favorite to be the next mayor of New York City. The only thing that could change that is if all the independent and Republican candidates drop out and support Andrew Cuomo as the one candidate to stop Mamdani. At that point, there would be a lot of Democrats and independents and Republicans behind Cuomo and a lot of money likely being thrown behind him, that at that point you would have to take his candidacy seriously, and then it become a very close race. But in a split field like this, Zohran Mamdani is going to become the next mayor of New York City, and these candidates are really just splitting the anti-Zoran vote. Now, if it became Zoran versus Cuomo, in that matchup, I do think it's still possible Mamdani could win, and in large part being that Cuomo is not a very popular figure in New York City. The question is, who's more unpopular come election day, Mamdani or Cuomo? I would argue it's more likely that Cuomo would still be more unpopular than Mamdani come election day, but Cuomo would have to get lucky and narrowly eke out a narrow victory versus Mamdani to have any chance at defeating him in that regard. Because come election day, I do expect Mamdani's approval ratings to be higher than Andrew Cuomo's is, even if there was a unified effort to try and stop Mamdani. Cuomo's approval ratings would still be worse. So that's the latest on the New York City mayoral race right now. Leave all your thoughts, comments, questions you have below. Can't wait to check all those out, so make sure you do that. Also, make sure to hit like and subscribe as you get notified as I post more videos every single day. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video.